Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of The Boardroom, where, as always, we are chatting to leading business minds, people who can help the business community to discuss some of the biggest issues facing our business community at the moment. We're live on Facebook at the moment, so it would be lovely if you had any questions, you can add them below, and we will try to put them to our interviewees. But if you don't, this will be streamed back on who'swho.mt, which is Malta's leading business portal. Now, today's topic is the fight against money laundering, and of course, Malta's fight specifically against money laundering. And we have a very interesting panel today. I'm happy to have with me three members of the FIAU team. They are Alfred Zammit, the Deputy Director, Consuelo Marzi, the Senior Manager for the Supervision Section, and Clara Bonaci, who is the Manager of Guidance and Outreach. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you. Thank you so much for being with me on the Boardroom. This is a very interesting topic, something that I know a lot of our viewers will be interested in learning more about. So I look forward to having this discussion with you, and let's jump right in. Alfred, I'd love to come to you first to understand a little more about the fact that the key role of the FIAU is to fight money laundering and the funding of terrorism, such an important topic. But perhaps we can begin just by understanding what money laundering even is.
Hi, Joanne. Thank you very much for the question, and welcome to all our listeners. Yes, actually, it's well, everything we do here at the FIU is in a way connected to the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. So in a way, we're an authority, we're an agency that is focused solely on the topic of combating money laundering and terrorism financing, which is really important. But what is actually money laundering? That's a really good question, and sometimes it's good to go to the basics and understand what it is all about. And then perhaps I'll also touch on terrorism financing. But money laundering, first we need to start off with understanding sort of what lies beneath money laundering. And actually, when you look at crimes that are committed, well, most crimes are committed by criminals to generate proceeds, to generate a profit, and we can refer to that profit as a gain, or as proceeds of crime. And when I talk of therefore what underlies, what is beneath money laundering, we're talking of very serious crimes, very serious offences. We're talking of drug trafficking, fraud, human smuggling, and human trafficking. We're talking of organized crime, corruption, bribery, counterfeiting, extortion, usury, kidnapping, and obviously ransom money, the commissioning of murders, and even tax evasion. So the list is endless, and most of these crimes are obviously done by criminals to make money out of it, and therefore. This money, the proceeds that these crimes generate, is we can refer to it as proceeds of crime, but it is more colloquially known as dirty money. And obviously, dirty money needs to be cleaned. So this is what money laundering is about. So money laundering is that process that criminals, and I say money laundering in the traditional sense, because actually the definition is a bit broader, but the traditional sort of understanding of the money laundering is that process that criminals use to be able to convert dirty money into clean money, so that its origin then looks legitimate. And once they've succeeded, once dirty money is made to look as though it's legitimate, as though it's clean, and it's in the financial system, well, then criminals can use it however they want to use it. They can use it to just fund their lives, to buy property, to buy luxury vehicles, jewelry. But even worse than that is also to actually fund their own activities as criminals. So to continue carrying out more criminal activity. So when we are fighting money laundering, we're also fighting the underlying offenses. So it is very important to fight money laundering for different reasons. But the idea behind this offense, which perhaps we can also look at it as a rather innovative way to fight crime, in the sense that if we talk about the traditional underlying crimes like theft, even a child would know that theft is something wrong. It's not right to go and steal something. You can see, So whereas money laundering is a very innovative way to be able to deal with crime and actually attack, sort of go for the proceeds of crime and take those proceeds away from the criminals. And this is what really gets to them. Putting a criminal in jail for a year or 2 or 3, they might, they might be fine with that. But actually, then when you take away all their proceeds, that hits them bad. So this is what money laundering is about. Terrorism financing is a little bit different. Perhaps there's no need to go into too much detail in today's. Let's focus on money laundering. But terrorism financing is rather where the money is coming from. Terrorism financing is entirely different. It's about funding terrorists directly or indirectly. So the money can be completely clean and legitimate, but then the use that is being made of with that money after is going to fund the terrorist activities directly or indirectly. Anything, even simply supporting someone, just has to have a place for them to rent and to stay. If they are terrorists, that is actually terrorism financing. So there are two very fundamental differences between the two. Thank you, Joe.
Of course, thank you. That's such an interesting introduction there, Alfred, to sort of set this conversation off as we start to understand why we need to care about this on a national and obviously international level as well. And Consuelo, perhaps you can tell me a little bit more about that and why this is such a critical fight.
Yeah, so thank you for that intro, Alfred. Just to put things into perspective, I'm going to start off by giving you some statistics. So the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that the amount of money laundered globally is between 715 billion to 1.9 trillion euros each year. So as you can see, the range is very wide, and it basically just goes to show how difficult it is to track and estimate the extent of the criminal activity which is going on. So as Alfred pointed out, the point of preventing money laundering is to stop criminals from enjoying the profits that they have earned through their extremely harmful and, of course, very dangerous illegal activities. So as Alfred said, what are these activities? We're talking about human trafficking, we're talking about tax evasion, theft, fraud, corruption. These are just some examples. So if we can prevent money laundering, we're eventually preventing the activity from being beneficial. And obviously this would act to stop criminals, because if they can't enjoy the proceeds, the activity becomes less appealing. So that's basically the reason for this fight. And of course, there's also the terrorism financing aspect of things. On this point, I'd like to mention that funding of terrorism is a really serious issue. And I think people tend to think about it small scale attacks. They think about lone wolf attacks. And here, there are sometimes minimal expenses involved. But the reality is that terror organizations, they operate in a very sophisticated manner, such as they operate like large business organizations, really and truly. So they use company structures to channel funds and to carry out training and recruitment to support their day-to-day expenses. Now, they sometimes launder or generate millions of euros. So to do this, you need proper infrastructure to launder this money. So the money is moving through banks, it's moving through payment service providers, and someone's doing their accounting. It's a very complex organization. So in order to tackle this, you require adequate detection and supervision in order to prevent these organizations from flourishing. It's also really important to keep in mind, and I think this is a really crucial point, is that the prevention of money laundering or terrorist financing is more effective in protecting communities from harm than pursuing prosecution of the activity after it happens. So that's, I think, a reason why this fight is so important. I hope that answers your question, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely, Consuelo. And my goodness, hearing those numbers at the start of your explanation there, I mean, to think if we had that kind of money in society in a public and legitimate way, what we could do with that money and the positive impact it could have. It's really frustrating to think that that's being tied up in these illegal activities. So, Consuelo, I'd love to stay with you on this one, just for you to tell me a little bit more now about the FIAU and what it is that you guys are doing to sort of effectively fight these practices.
Sure. So I'm going to run you through just some ideas of how the supervisory section is involved in the fight, basically. So the role of the supervisory section in the FIU basically stems from the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and it revolves around monitoring AML and CFT compliance by subject persons. Now, when I say subject persons, I'm referring to legal or natural persons who carry out relevant activity or relevant financial business, such as a bank, for example. So we are doing this in terms of the prevention of money laundering and funding of terrorism. Now, how do we do this role? The fulfillment of the role is basically based on two pillars. The first is the identification and assessment of money laundering and terrorism financing risk. and then the supervision of adherence to AML obligations by subject persons. So in order to perform these functions, our section is split into various teams. Each team supervises various sections. For example, we'll have a gaming team that supervises gaming companies. Now, it's important to keep in mind that AML-CFT regulations have been designed to help identify and prevent money laundering. Therefore, us ensuring that subject persons adhere to these obligations is a really vital process in the fight. And because, as I said before, which again, I'm going to repeat because I think it's really crucial, is that the prevention of money laundering is more effective in protective communities than actually pursuing prosecution after the activity has happened. So supervision is carried out using a risk-based approach. And the principle here is that resources should be directed in accordance with priorities so that the greatest risks receive the highest attention. Therefore, a risk-based approach essentially involves tailoring the supervisory response to fit the assessed risk. Now, this approach actually allows supervisors to allocate finite resources because we have over 2,000 subject persons in Malta. We do not have 2,000 employees. So you really need to dedicate resources to where the biggest risks lay. So that's really important for us. And I'm also going to speak more about the various types of supervision and how risk-based supervision has kind of changed things when we go into the challenges that we face as an authority. So I'm just going to hand over to you, Alfred, now, so you can speak about the role of the intelligence analysis section in fighting money laundering.
Great.
Thank you, Consuelo. Yes, so as you know, Joe, the FIAU has a number of different functions, and Consuelo has just touched on the function of supervision, and I'm not going to touch on a very different function, which is the function of the financial intelligence unit. So just to provide some context, every country is required to have a financial intelligence unit. And this is set out in the international standards that countries, as far as possible, should embed in their national policies. And these standards are set by the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. And therefore, here in Malta, the Financial Intelligence Unit is here at the FIAU, and the role of the Financial Intelligence Unit, which I will see to explain, and this is perhaps also really interesting as it is sometimes misunderstood and not very well known, is first and foremost to receive what we refer to as suspicious reports. So, and I will touch on this later, but banks and financial institutions and what we refer to in Malta as subject persons, such as in those entities who are obliged to ensure that they adhere to their anti-money laundering obligations, we refer to them as subject persons. So we're talking of banks, financial institutions, companies, service providers, trustees, notaries, accountants, real estate agents. And when they have a suspicion, they're obliged to report that suspicion of money laundering or terrorism financing to the FIAU. And so the role of the FIAU is first and foremost to receive reports of suspicious activity. And why, okay, perhaps I can ask then, why is a report submitted? And there are a number of reasons. Actually, we actually keep track of all the reasons as to why reports are submitted to the FIAU. Just to give you a few examples, it could be that, for example, a customer his behavior gives rise to suspicion, or a customer who suddenly receives a huge, a significant transaction which is unexplained and which is not in line with the profile of that customer. I'll just give you a simple example. An employee who receives a salary, an annual salary of 30,000 euros and suddenly receives an incoming payment which appears to be strange. And then, for example, a bank would have to look into it. A bank is obliged to do so, and if they do so, and for example, the customer is evasive, doesn't provide information, acts in a very suspicious manner, that is likely to give rise to a suspicious transaction report. So we receive these suspicious transaction reports, plenty of them. Just to give you an idea, in 2020, we received over 5,000 suspicious transaction reports. And the role of a financial intelligence unit is to analyze these reports, to look at them, prioritize cases, and also then decide which cases require further analysis. And as a financial intelligence unit, we have wide powers to obtain more information. So we would obtain information then as we are working on a case from other sources nationally, from other financial institutions, from banks, from even from government, other government authorities. And our aim is to add value to these suspicious transaction reports and carry out an analysis, which is different from a criminal investigation. We are not investigators, we are not criminal investigators. And then where we see that there is a reasonable suspicion of money laundering. So we receive suspicious transaction reports, but we have to identify if there's a reasonable suspicion, which is one step higher. Then in those cases where there is a reasonable suspicion, we would actually forward our intelligence report, our own analytical report, to the police for further investigation. Having said that, we also have other roles. We also cooperate very strongly with, very regularly with other FIUs all over the globe. So we receive, even as they are carrying out their analysis, they may need information from Malta. So we will receive hundreds of requests, and we use obviously our powers as well to obtain information to be able to provide our foreign FIUs with the information that they need. And similarly, when we are carrying out our own analysis here in Malta, we send several requests to our counterpart FIUs internationally, and literally this is from all over the world. So this is, in a nutshell, the basic role of a financial intelligence unit, which therefore would seem to play the role of a filter between the reporting entities, such as banks, and the police. So our role is, in a way, to filter, to analyze and filter what stays with us and what goes to the police. We have other roles. For example, we recently launched, apart from obviously supervision that Consuelo mentioned, we recently launched a central bank account registry, which is a requirement now under EU law. And this has now been entrusted to the FIU. And the central bank account registry, for example, is in it we have financial information on all the bank accounts in Malta, opened by banks and also financial institutions. So literally, in a matter of seconds, we can simply, when we are carrying out an analysis, access this database, which we ourselves manage, to check whether someone who we are carrying out analysis on has a bank account or not, and also other authorities to have access to this database, such as the police and the Asset Recovery Bureau, among others. So this is an ancillary role, but it also greatly facilitates the process. For an FIU to work efficiently, it needs to be able to tap into information really quickly. As you know, we live in a highly advanced world, and money flows money transactions through internet banking and other systems can take place in seconds. So sometimes we need to block transactions if we see that it is very suspicious, and therefore, but to do that, we need to have some solid ground. So being able to access information very quickly is critical for us to be able to work. So that tries to sort of sum up in a few words what the role of a financial intelligence unit is, so I thank you for that question, Joe. Thank you.
Not at all. It's my pleasure. And wow, it sounds like it sounds fascinating and really interesting, and a bit like a spy film, but it probably isn't. So Clara, I'd love to get your thoughts on that question as well, if at all possible.
Yes, and so one thing I want to touch upon that Alfred mentioned is that the FIU isn't an investigator. Perhaps this might be a bit of a misconception. Our intelligence work is based on analysis. So what's the difference? It's a bit different. It's more preliminary. It has more to do with gathering a lot of information at an early stage. But here I just want to mention that the FIAU works within a much longer, much larger chain. So we work with law enforcement authorities, as they are, of course, responsible for investigating and prosecuting money laundering, and that's something that Alfred touched upon. But at this point, it's really good to explain that there are actually quite a few other bodies and authorities in Malta, but also within anti-money laundering frameworks in countries around the world that have a role in preventing money laundering from taking place, so in detecting, investigating, prosecuting, and everything that goes on in between. So some people might think that money laundering is just anti-money laundering. Really, it's just in the hands of the FIAU. And while that is our main priority, it's much, much wider than that. So, for example, I'm just going to mention some other bodies and authorities that people might not know have a role in fighting money laundering in Malta. So, for instance, we'll start with the state advocate, with the responsibility of making sure that the right laws are in place. So, for example, the laws to criminalize money laundering, to set effective and dissuasive and harsh punishments, to see that the bodies have the right powers to carry out their functions and to exchange information locally and internationally to be able to carry out their work. we also need to make sure that the subject persons, which is what Consuelo mentioned earlier, so companies like banks and financial service providers, gaming companies, real estate agents, lawyers, accountants and auditors, basically the entities that the FIAU supervises. We just need to make sure, Malta needs to make sure that these companies and professionals aren't run by criminals with bad intentions. So then there's bodies such as the MFSA, the MGA, and other licensing bodies, and these come in to carry out market entry checks and even ongoing checks to make sure that persons holding key positions within these companies have a good reputation and have a good background. On the more investigative side, besides the police, and that's the obvious, we also work and share information, for instance, with the Attorney General, with customs, with the tax authorities, and there's also the Asset Recovery Bureau that locates and confiscates criminal proceeds and criminal assets, whatever form they may take and whichever country they may be in, and that can get very complex. But this is just to name a few more prominent roles in this fight. And then there's also the National Coordinating Committee, for instance. Every country with an effective framework has a national body that carries out risk assessments, so money laundering and even sectoral risk assessments to see where the more prominent risks and vulnerabilities of a particular country lie when it comes to money laundering and terrorism financing, and then make sure that all the bodies that I mentioned and more are coordinated in the way they use their resources and the way they prioritize their work to attack those risks first. So all these different roles come together as sort of building blocks for an effective system with no missing links. And that's just locally. So internationally, Alfred touched upon this as well. We also exchange information on suspicious transactions, and we collect information from what we call our counterpart financial intelligence units around the world, but we also exchange and share information with supervisors around the world. If, for example, we're supervising an entity that has connections or that has branches in other places of the world. And in between, then there are the things that the FIAU does. We participate in different European and international fora from an operational, but also on technical, legal aspects to share our experiences and improve this framework. And even the companies and the professionals that we regulate have a role to play in preventing money laundering. Again, Alfred spoke about this earlier. I don't know, Joe, if you're interested in hearing a bit more on this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm so interested to hear more about what you touched upon earlier, Alfred, when you mentioned sort of it's banks and notaries and real estate agents and gaming companies and sort of everybody has this sort of role to play. And I'll be honest, I hadn't really thought of it in that way. So perhaps it would be nice to talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, Joe, sure, thank you. Yes, well, they have a very important role to play. And actually, I think I should start off with explaining why they have a role to play in combating money laundering and terrorism financing. And obviously, in so doing, they're also protecting Malta's reputation and also Malta's business community. Just like many other countries, we have had our fair share of sad stories here in Malta, and now it is even more clear to everyone, even to the general public, how really critical it is for everyone to carry their weight. I mean, the authorities, of course, and also the players in the private sector. So let me just start off with something really basic. Why are reporting entities or subject persons, why are they subject persons in the first place? I mean, yes, I can I can reply really simply and saying, well, because that's the law, and that's because what the international standards require, and that's what EU law requires. But that's not the answer that I would like to give. They've been sort of made to be reporting entities, subject persons, because of the risk that there exists of them being used by criminals to launder proceeds of crime. So when we look at banks, so I can start off with banks and financial institutions, they play such an important role, transferring of funds, movement of funds, that money launderers cannot really launder proceeds of crime without using banks, financial institutions, and other entities. So when we look at the services and the products that subject persons provide, such as banks, financial institutions, company service providers, the setting up of companies, of course, all these services are used for very legitimate reasons. We all have a bank account, right? But of course, just as we all have a bank account and we use it legitimately, the services offered by subject persons can be misused by criminals. In other words, criminals who need to launder proceeds of crime need will inevitably use at some point in time the services of a subject person. So subject persons have a very important role in the whole system, in the whole chain that is designed internationally, globally, to fight money laundering. And they have two basic roles, if we can look at it like that. The first is the preventative side. And by preventative, I mean, as much as possible, we should, and therefore reporting entities should prevent themselves from being misused by criminals. So they need to know who their customers are. They need to identify, make sure they know who are dealing with, putting it really, really simply. They need to, apart from knowing who they are dealing with, they need to have enough information to be able to identify something is unusual or suspicious. So they need to, apart from simply knowing who their customer is, also have an understanding of the customer. What if I'm setting up a bank account? What am I going to do with a bank account? If I'm a company, why am I opening a bank account? If I'm an individual and I want to set up a company, why am I setting up a company? What do I want to do with this company, right? So subject persons need, as far as possible, to prevent criminals from being serviced. So that's the preventative side. As much as possible, prevention is better than the cure, and the best thing is simply to avoid in the first place onboarding someone who intends to use your services to launder proceeds of crime. No matter how many controls in place an entity puts, there will always be someone who manages to slip through the net. So then the second role that they have is to identify suspicion. So it's preventative, but then after that, at least there should be strong controls in place. If a customer is doing something that's very unusual or suspicious, subject persons are to look into it and to identify whether there is suspicion or not. And then if there is suspicion, then report that suspicion to us, to the FIAU. And this is how it works everywhere in all the countries. And therefore, without them, the FIAUs, not only obviously here in Malta, but all FIAUs in the world, depend so much on receiving valuable intelligence from subject persons. So it's all, and many cases that we've seen here in Malta and even in other countries are good stories of how investigations were triggered by a simple suspicious transaction report and then went to the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, passed it on to the police carried out further investigative work, obtained evidence from other countries, etc., led to a prosecution and indictment. So there are several success stories all around the globe. And this is therefore why subject persons have such an important role, because only they see what they get to see. We cannot be everywhere and anywhere at the same time. So they're seeing their side of the story, and if they see something that's suspicious, they have to report it. So the system depends very much on what happens at the very start of the whole chain. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jo.
Not at all. Thank you for that, Alfred. A lot of really great insight there into the role that sort of we all play in this fight, and I'm sure that will be food for thought for some of our viewers. I know that something we think about as the general public a lot is sort of things like FATF and money val. These are the things that we hear about, and I think it's important to touch upon those. And perhaps, Clara, I could come to you to tell me a little bit more about those aspects of the work that you do.
Sure, of course, Jo. So it will be hard to have an interview with the FIAU without perhaps speaking a bit about the FATF and Money Val and just explaining what they are, what they do, how it has anything to do with Malta at all. So first, I'll just start off by explaining that perhaps something to bear in mind, something to remember is that, for instance, criminal activity in one country can lead to funds being generated in another country, and that money can be moved around the world, around different countries, around different entities. So criminals will always look for the easiest places where laws and enforcement are a bit more lax and they're a bit less likely to get caught, less likely to get detected, systems are a bit less sophisticated and so on. So to fight all this that's going on globally, it takes a global effort, because if only a handful of countries have strong, robust systems, it's just not going to be enough. It's just not going to work, not even for those particular countries that still feel the effect of it. So bear with me as I take us through history for just 1 second. So in 1989, 1989, the G7 Group of Countries Summit, which I'm sure you have heard of, established the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is a body based on fighting money laundering and the funding of terrorism. Now, the FATF issued a document that we refer to as the 40 recommendations, the FATF recommendations. And this is basically a report that contains sort of 40 building blocks, 40 must-haves, if you will, for that a country needs to have an effective anti-money laundering regime. So what I was speaking about earlier. Now, these FATF recommendations aren't binding, so it's not like a treaty or a convention, but this is the beauty of it, if you will. Every country is assessed, almost every country is assessed periodically. There are rounds to see whether all the recommendations, all the FATF recommendations are in place, so whether that country is in line with the standards. And if a country isn't in line, then there's a process that can lead to, it's a long process, but it can lead to a country being grey listed. So this is a term that we're hearing around us a lot. The term is an informal one, but it works. So that's the term. So this means if you are grey listed, or even worse, blacklisted, but that's reserved for some really naughty countries, that means that you have deficiencies in your anti-money laundering system. So you're seen internationally as a higher risk country, and unfortunately that makes it a lot harder to attract business and to retain existing business. So what the FATF does is it leverages this international power that it has to try and get all the countries of the world to comply. So, and then that's a bit about the FATF. Then there's Moneyval. So what's Moneyval? Again, it's a body. So as a member of the Council of Europe, Malta falls under the remit of Moneyval, so to speak. Moneyval is a regional body styled like the FATF. In fact, it's referred to as an FATF style regional body. And in this case, it's for the European region, and there are a number of other regional bodies for different areas of the globe. And the Moneyval, you can say, assesses countries in Europe sort of on behalf of the FATF. So this assessment, that is a periodic assessment, so there are different rounds of assessment, and now we are in the 5th round of assessment. It looks at whether the country's laws and the procedures are set up correctly on paper and in terms of systems on one hand. So that's what we refer to as technical compliance. So if you're compliant on a technical perspective, and then whether these laws, systems, procedures, bodies, authorities, powers, etc., are actually effective. So it's easy to have something correct on paper as a system, but the proof is whether they are actually effective, whether they are actually reaping the results. So whether the country is carrying out effective anti-money laundering supervision, that's Consuelo's job, whether there is effective international cooperation between the countries and information is being exchanged, and FIUs are providing useful information, not just FIUs, but also police and so on, whether investigations and prosecution of money laundering and terrorism financing is taking place. And it also gets a bit more complex. So they look at whether the cases that the country is prosecuting are in line with the risks associated with that country, and so on. So that's what's referred to as the effectiveness aspect. And perhaps, as you can think, demonstrating effectiveness is usually a lot more challenging than demonstrating technical compliance. So, like all Moneyval countries, and this is where it ties to Malta, Malta underwent its 5th round of assessment. So like I said, this is something that is periodic, and this is our 5th round. And this time around, Moneyval concluded that parts of the local framework for fighting money laundering and the funding of terrorism were not as effective as they should be. So it issued a report with the findings, and a number of recommendations were also made on a number of these different building blocks or aspects that I mentioned earlier. And then Malta had some time to address these recommendations. So the different bodies and authorities that I mentioned earlier had to address these recommendations so that Malta can improve in the areas that were identified as being weak. So just a very brief update, as much as I can say, on where we stand now, which is something that I'm sure most people are interested. So the FATF is now in the process of seeing whether Malta has addressed these recommendations in full and achieved sufficient progress, and then in which case Malta will be removed from the review process. So remember, I said that the FATF recommendations aren't legally binding, but you can clearly see the power of the FATF to bring the world to comply. And here I just want to point out that the anti-money laundering rules of all countries, of all jurisdictions, are modeled on the FATF standards, obviously because they have to be compliant with the FATF recommendations. And so, for instance, are the EU anti-money laundering directives, but I won't get into the legal part of it. Perhaps it's also good to point out that the FIAU is constantly being assessed by other bodies too. This is something normal that supervisors, authorities, and FIAUs around the world are subject to. So to name a few, we have periodic assessments by the European Commission, the European Banking Authority, the International Monetary Fund. We're also assessed to see how we're complying with international treaties and conventions, and this is all positive because it's all part of the chain to ensure that things are working and things are in place. So I hope this gave you some insight.
Absolutely, Clara. I mean, a lot to take in there. My goodness, there's so much that you and the team at the FIAU are doing, and in fact, it sounds like a very, very challenging environment to be working in. And I'd love to understand a little bit more about whether it is as challenging as it sounds. Perhaps Consuelo, you could tell us a little bit more about that first.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one of the biggest challenges, especially from a supervisory aspect, has definitely been this transition from a rule-based approach to a risk-based approach. Now, this transition comes in line with international and EU standards, because as Clara correctly pointed out, it's the FATF that sort of sets these international AML standards, and then the countries follow these standards. So it's the FATF that has set these standards that have moved towards risk-based supervision. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that it's not only subject persons that have had to shift towards risk-based approach, but also the regulator. So the Prevention of Money Laundering Act actually states that the FIU should carry out its duties on a risk-sensitive basis. So what does this mean? This means that the FIU needs to determine the frequency as well as the intensity of supervision based on an assessment of the risk profile of the subject person. So you might be wondering, okay, how do you build this risk profile? So in order to build a comprehensive risk profile, the FIU actually launched the CASPAR system in 2019. So CASPAR is a compliance and supervision platform for assessing risk. And this system has really helped us to facilitate and enhance the risk assessment of subject persons. So what happens is the FIU builds a risk profile. Now we do this with various data. I'm just gonna give you an example of some of the data we use. We use information that the subject person provides. So they provide us this through the risk evaluation questionnaire, which is commonly known as the REQ. We also use information from the prudential supervisor, from the national and supranational risk assessment, and past compliance examinations and adverse media. So as I mentioned before, the principle is always that the resources are directed in accordance with the priorities. So the greatest risks are the ones that should receive the highest attention. So in practice, based on the risk profile, we then adapt various methods, various supervisory methods. So these include compliance examinations, which of course vary in scope. And we can also set supervisory meetings. Something that I'd really like to point out here, and it's also been pointed out by the FATF in a recent guidance document that they published, is that mutual evaluations reveal that making this transition from rule-based to risk-based is a challenging task. So this has not only for Malta, but for other jurisdictions worldwide that are applying this shift. The FATF actually noted that supervisors need a good understanding of risks, a strong legal basis, political and organizational support, and adequate capacity and resources in order to succeed in implementing a robust risk-based supervisory approach. So ultimately, this shift takes time, and it requires a huge change in the supervisory culture. It requires investment in training and capacity building, and so on. So yes, it's been a significant challenge, as I said, not just for subject persons, but also for the regulator, so for the FIU as a regulator. Alfred, maybe you can take us through some challenges that you've faced.
Thanks, Consuelo. Well, I think perhaps it's more challenging than it actually sounds, Joe, as you mentioned before. But there are several challenges as well that we're facing, as not only we as an FIU, but also subject persons in Malta. As we can see, regulation is constantly on the increase. Obviously, to be able to comply with all the obligations that are in place, there's a significant cost to compliance as well. To buy, for example, get access to systems, to screening systems, to have compliance teams in place, particularly for larger institutions, and because of the cost involved. So one of the things that we are trying to do as well is to help subject persons understand that compliance isn't simply a cost with no benefit, but actually there is it pays to be compliant. Not also because of the sort of the legal risks of being non-compliant, but also for businesses to protect themselves, to protect their integrity, their reputation, to make sure as well that they do not end up embroiled in a large-scale money laundering operation or something of the sort. So one of the challenges that well, maybe I'm not very comfortable calling it a challenge because we're actually seeing an improvement, is that of helping subject persons understand the importance of compliance and not simply seeing it as a cost. And we're seeing there several improvements, and we have some very good stories and good examples where subject persons have, on their own motion, not because we asked them to or something, but because they actually decided to invest much more in their compliance teams. With that, there's also the challenge that we face, and again, this is happening in many other countries, where we need to strike the right balance with compliance and trying to, as far as possible, not having an approach that isn't risk-based. Even subject persons need to adopt a risk-based approach, not only us as supervisors, as Consuelo mentioned, but, for example, banks and other entities need to adopt a risk-based approach with their clients. And that can be a challenge for them too. They might be scared, they might take an overly cautious approach, maybe ask too many questions, more than is actually necessary. And we're seeing that this is also impacting the business community. So as from our side, what we're trying to do to address this as well is to improve the understanding of subject persons when it comes to dealing with customer due diligence. They too need to adopt a risk-based approach, and this is also one of our responsibilities. There are other challenges that I can touch on if we have the time. For example, the fact that we have to improve the way we communicate with the general public, which brings us actually to this session here. These sessions here were sort of few and far between a few years ago, but we have realized the importance of actually communicating more and reaching out, not just with subject persons in Malta, but also trying to raise more awareness on what money laundering is, and raise sort of a general awareness on the subject for everyone to understand, even for persons to understand why a service provider is asking, for example, questions. Finally, perhaps one last challenge. We've grown significantly as here at the FIAU. We have now reached a staff complement of over 100 employees, compared to less than 50 in 2017, for example. So we've grown massively, but this also presents another challenge to grow. There's a huge investment being made here into us, and also in other authorities who have a role to play in the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. But obviously, recruitment is not very easy. It sometimes can be quite difficult to find the right persons with the right experience and the skill set. Fortunately, we're doing quite well, but we have invested heavily in recruitment and staff retention programs. In fact, right now we're benefiting from we have a very good staff retention rate, and I think we have a really good team here at the FIAU, and many of us are really passionate about the work that we do, and I think this helps in that regard. Thanks. Thank you, Joe.
Not at all. Thank you, Alfred. I mean, from what you've all said there, it's the field you've chosen to work in is a challenging one, and I'm sure you no doubt encounter a number of obstacles. So as we sort of wrap up our conversation today, I'd love to know a little bit more about what drives you and what keeps you going in this really fascinating but challenging field. So Consuelo, maybe you could start.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, when I explained the importance of the fight against money laundering and the funding of terrorism, I think it's really important to keep in mind that money laundering and funding of terrorism have really far-reaching consequences, and these consequences have the potential to affect us all. So allowing money laundering to flourish creates significant obstacles to development. One also has to keep in mind that there are huge reputational risks here. So it's really important to ensure that a country's AML CFT framework is strong, and this prevents the country being placed in a negative spotlight. So I think this is the reality of money laundering, and it's really far-reaching, and it really doesn't just stop at tax evasion. So it's a really motivating factor to me. Clara, I'm going to hand over to you now to give us some examples of what motivates you.
Sure. More or less, I feel the same way as you, I think, as we all do. But one thing I want to mention is that you don't always immediately see the effects of the work you do. And I think people around us also don't see perhaps immediately the effects of what we do. But we always know, and people should always know, that it's contributing to something much more powerful and to something actually beneficial, something good. So I think the biggest thing is that our work has a purpose. So, and when you're working in that type of environment and you're driven by all the factors that Consuelo mentioned, you're seeing certain harm take place, you're seeing certain illegalities, certain criminal activities take place, and you're driven to work through even the long days, long nights, weekends as well. We do that here where needed. So, but it also helps again that the people here at the FIAU are very, very passionate about what they do. There's a very strong spirit of teamwork, and I think you can tell here when you come into the office that most people feel the same way, and the way that we work with each other, the way that we share information. So it's a passion. It's the fact that we work for a purpose, and the fact that perhaps, if I may, we work for a greater good. So I think, Alfred, perhaps you'd like to close this off with why you're driven to work here.
Actually, there's not very much to add. In a way, I don't want to be repetitive, but for many of us here, I mean, what started out as just a job, including myself many years ago, turned out very quickly not to be just a job. It's more than that. It's what one could refer to as a mission. But we're not here to work for a profit, to make our shareholders happy. I mean, nothing wrong with that, of course, but we're actually here to fight crime. As I mentioned before, it's not just money laundering, but by fighting money laundering, we're also fighting crime. And this creates a sense of camaraderie. It is very fulfilling. And although there's over 100 employees here at the FIAU, when you look at the structure of the FIAU and the way we're set up, there are several small teams. And everyone, therefore, every single person here at the FIAU has a very important role to play. And we all make a difference. And when you know that you're actually making a difference, well, that keeps you going. So I think this pretty much also sort of is in line with what my colleagues have just mentioned. But it really is a huge driving force here at the FIAU, and it's a really, you mentioned the spy film. I would say it's better than that, but actually, I don't watch them anymore. But what we have here at the FIAU is more than enough.
I'm sure it certainly sounds very exciting, very purposeful, and it's great to understand a little bit more about the human side of this fight and what it is that you're achieving. So thank you very much for your work. Thank you for the insight that you've given us today, and I'm sure our viewers will take a lot from it, understand their role as well in what can be done, and also how we, the importance of working on this fight together. So thank you for being with me on the boardroom. I really appreciate having you all here. And thank you, of course, to our viewers at home or in the office. It's wonderful having you with us on the boardroom, and I look forward to seeing you on a future episode.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.